Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on some pretty interesting stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
hmm
So there's all these articles and reports, financial stuff, expert opinions, and all that.
hmm
They all seem to be saying the same thing. Like there's this potential shift happening in U.S. politics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and especially after the election. With Trump back in the White House,
Right.
a lot of people are kind of on edge about what his policies could mean.
I bet. Yeah.
Some are even saying, and this is going to sound a little crazy, but some are saying the U.S. could be
What?
trending towards fascism.
Wow. That's
I
uh
know, right?
that's a heavy
I
statement.
mean, it is, and then you add in Elon Musk, you know.
Oh, yeah.
His wealth has just skyrocketed since the election.
Yeah, and he's like chummy with Trump, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. He's all buddy-buddy with Trump, and that's got a lot of people raising their eyebrows.
It's certainly interesting.
That's one way to put it.
So,
So that's what we're diving into today. Is there actually any evidence to back up this whole fascism thing?
well, first we got to figure out like what exactly is fascism?
Yeah, good point. Sometimes it feels like people throw that word around, like whenever they don't like a certain political system.
Totally. It's like this catch-all term.
Yeah, so what are the signs? What are we actually looking for here?
So, from the sources you've shared, some key characteristics pop up. A biggie is the merging of state and business leadership.
So like corporations having too much influence in the government?
Exactly. Think of it as like this cozy little club where corporations and the government are all buddy-buddy, practically a single power structure.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
And historically, there are some pretty scary examples of this. Nazi Germany, for one, you had those big-time industrialists like Gustav Krupp and Alfred Hugenberg.
Oh, well.
They were totally entangled with the Nazi regime. Their companies were basically fueling the war machine.
That's a chilling example.
It is. So, are there any parallels in what we're looking at today? Well, for starters, there's the fact that companies like Amazon and Meta donated a ton of money to Trump's inaugural fund.
Right, I saw that in one of the articles. But isn't it kind of normal for companies to donate to political campaigns?
Sure, it is. But the question here is like, how much influence do these donations buy? And we're not talking about your local bakery chipping in a few bucks. These are tech giants with like crazy resources.
Ah, so their donations could actually sway government policy.
You got it. And that could benefit them, maybe even at the expense of the average person?
So it's not just about the money itself, but the potential consequences.
Precisely. It ties back into that whole fascism thing where the lines get all blurry between what corporations want and what the government does.
Makes sense. And another thing that kind of stood out to me in these sources was, well, Trump seems to really like those strongman leaders, like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey.
Interesting. Both Orban and Erdogan have been accused of, well, not exactly playing by the rules of democracy. They've been consolidating power, silencing opposition, all that.
Yeah, and the fact that Trump kind of admires those guys, it's a little,
It raises some red flags for sure.
it does, especially when you consider that Trump himself seems to try and squash any dissent here in the U.S. Remember that L.A. Times thing where the owner basically said, no negative editorials about Trump unless they gave an opposite view?
Yeah, that was pretty weird.
It was, and it's not an isolated incident. There was that thing where Trump supposedly threatened ABC, said they could lose their broadcasting license if they didn't settle a lawsuit his way. Oh, and his lawsuit against the Des Moines Register and their pollster.
Yeah, it does seem like he has a habit of going after anyone who criticizes him, especially in the media.
And that's right out of the fascist playbook, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to control the narrative by silencing anyone who challenges the status quo.
Textbook, yeah. And then you've got Elon Musk. I mean, the guy's wealth has just exploded since the election, and now he's leading Trump's Department of Government Efficiency initiative.
Tearing, yeah.
Co-chairing, yeah. It's a situation that definitely needs a closer look. You have Musk, this like entrepreneurial superstar, now heading a government initiative. But at the same time, you have to wonder about conflicts of interest. His companies, Tesla, SpaceX, they depend a lot on government contracts and regulations.
You think he's really working for the people or just trying to help out his own companies?
It's a good question. And some of the sources you shared, they really dig into Musk's business practices and his personality. And what they found isn't quite as rosy as the genius innovator image. Allegations of worker exploitation, shady business deals, even whispers of authoritarian tendencies.
Wow, so it goes deeper than we thought.
Deeper than we thought. So we're seeing some potential warning signs here. Corporations and government getting too cozy, attempts to shut down dissent, and this whole admiration for strongman leaders. But before we jump to conclusions, don't we have to acknowledge that the idea of fascism is kind of open to interpretation?
That's true. It's not like there's a dictionary definition everyone agrees on.
Yeah.
And some people might say that what we're seeing with Trump and his administration isn't quite fascism. Maybe it's more like a different brand of authoritarianism or populism.
Right.
So how do we make sense of all this? How do we figure out what's really going on?
Well, that's kind of what we're here for, right? By looking at these different perspectives, digging into the historical context, we can start to piece together a clearer picture. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've laid out some potential parallels between what's happening now and fascism. But what does that actually mean for us? Like, what are the real-world consequences if a country starts heading down that path?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to answer that, we can look to history. What happened in other countries that fell under fascist rule? One of the most devastating consequences is the loss of civil liberties.
You mean like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Those basic rights, they're often the first to go. And we've already talked about some examples of that happening here, with Trump trying to silence his critics and control what the media says. It's like slowly chipping away at the foundation of democracy.
It's kind of scary to think that could happen here in the U.S. I mean, we just assume we'll always have those freedoms.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of these patterns, to speak up when we see them happening. Because when freedom starts to erode, it often goes hand in hand with more surveillance and more government control. Fascist regimes, they're known for using propaganda, censorship, even violence to shut down dissent and hold on to power.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. The government watching your every move, controlling everything you do.
That's not far off. And it's not just about individual freedoms. Fascism also messes with the economy. Remember that whole merging of state and corporate power we were talking about?
Yeah, where corporations and the government become like one big power structure.
Right. And when that happens, you often get what's called crony capitalism. Businesses that are tight with the government get special treatment, competition gets stifled, and all the wealth ends up in the hands of a few.
Which brings us back to Elon Musk. I mean, his companies have gotten tons of government contracts and subsidies, and now he's in this powerful position where he could influence government policy to benefit himself even more.
It's a tricky situation, no doubt. On one hand, Musk's companies are doing some innovative stuff, space exploration, renewable energy, things that could have a positive impact. But on the other hand, you have these potential conflicts of interest and allegations of unethical business practices.
It's like that revolving door we see so often, people going back and forth between big business and government. We've seen it happen in other countries that have slid away from democracy.
Exactly. And let's not forget the allegations about some of Musk's companies exploiting workers, using questionable labor practices. It makes you think about the ethics of his power and influence.
So to recap, potential loss of civil liberties, corporations, and the government getting too close, and these concerns about powerful individuals using their influence for personal gain. It's a lot to think about. But is it possible we're blowing things out of proportion? I mean, the U.S. has a long history of democracy, strong institutions.
It's a valid point. And it's true. The U.S. system has checks and balances to prevent any one person or group from having too much power. But those institutions, they're not perfect. They rely on people actively participating in democracy, holding those in power accountable.
So what can we do to protect ourselves against these potential threats to democracy?
A big part of it is awareness. The more people understand the sneaky ways fascism can take root, the better we can resist it. Pay attention to the language used by politicians and in the media. Are certain groups being demonized or blamed for everything? Are facts and evidence being ignored in favor of emotional appeals and conspiracy theories? Are there attempts to make people lose trust in institutions like the media or the courts? These are all red flags we need to watch out for.
So it's not enough to just recognize these patterns. We have to speak out against them, right?
Okay.
If we see something that seems wrong, we can't just sit there quietly.
You got it. Silence can be seen as agreement. We need to be willing to call out these tactics when we see them, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it means having tough conversations with friends or family.
So what else can we do to push back against this slide toward authoritarianism?
One crucial step is to support and strengthen our democratic institutions. Advocate for a free and independent press, make sure elections are fair and transparent, promote civic education.
And I guess that also means holding our elected officials accountable, making sure they're working for the people, not just for themselves or special interest groups.
You nailed it. And it's not just about national politics. Get involved at the local level. Go to town hall meetings, contact your representatives, join community organizations. These are all ways to participate in democracy and make your voice heard.
But with all the political division these days, it seems harder than ever to have a real conversation about these issues. Everyone's stuck in their own echo chambers, talking to people who already agree with them.
That's a huge challenge for sure. And it's something authoritarian leaders love. They thrive on division and mistrust. So we need to bridge those divides, listen to different perspectives, and have respectful conversations, even when it's hard.
It's like we need to rebuild a shared reality, find some common ground where we can at least agree on basic facts and principles.
And that's where critical thinking comes in. We need to be able to look at information from different sources, question the stories we're being told, and form our own opinions based on facts.
Makes sense. But it's hard to stay optimistic when you see all this negativity happening in the world. How do we avoid getting discouraged and feeling like it's all too much?
It's totally understandable to feel overwhelmed, especially with all the bad news out there. But remember, throughout history, even in the darkest times, people have found ways to resist tyranny and fight for a better future.
Like those who resisted Nazi Germany, the civil rights activists who fought for equality, all the people who have stood up against oppression around the world.
Exactly. Their stories remind us that even small acts of resistance can make a difference. It's not always about grand gestures or heroic acts. It's about the choices we make every day, the conversations we have, the information we share, the organizations we support.
So even though things seem pretty rough right now, we shouldn't underestimate the power of individual and collective action.
I agree. The future isn't set in stone. We have the power to change things, both individually and as a society.
That's a good thought to keep in mind. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to thank you again for sharing your expertise. It's been a real eye-opener.
Happy to be here. And remember, stay informed, stay involved, and never lose hope. The future of democracy depends on it.
So we've talked about these potential red flags, pointing towards fascism, especially with Trump back in charge and guys like Elon Musk gaining more and more influence. It's a lot to take in, and honestly, it's kind of freaking me out. But what can we actually do about it? It feels like we're talking about these massive systemic problems.
It's true. These are some seriously complex issues. But history shows us that even systems that seem impossible to change, well, they can be challenged. And it often starts with just understanding how things work, seeing the patterns.
So knowledge is power, like they say.
Yeah, kinda. With fascism, one of the scariest things is how it can sneak in bit by bit. It's not always some dramatic takeover. It can start with these little shifts in what's considered normal, the weakening of democratic institutions, extreme views becoming more mainstream. It's like that frog in boiling water thing,
Yeah.
Toss a frog in boiling water, it jumps right out. But put it in lukewarm water and slowly turn up the heat, it won't even realize it's in danger until it's too late.
So we need to be on the lookout for those subtle signs, the small changes that could end up becoming something much bigger and more dangerous.
Exactly. And that means paying attention to how people are talking about politics. Are they demonizing certain groups, making them scapegoats? Are facts and evidence being tossed aside for emotional appeals and conspiracy theories? Are they trying to make people distrust institutions like the media or the courts? Those are all warning signs.
And it's not enough to just notice them, right?
Yeah.
You got to speak up.
Absolutely. Staying silent, that can be seen as going along with it. We have to be willing to call out these tactics, even if it's awkward, even if it means having tough conversations with people we know.
So what else can we do to push back against this whole authoritarianism thing?
One big thing is to support and strengthen our democratic institutions. Fight for a free and independent press. Make sure elections are fair and transparent. Promote civic education.
And I guess that means holding our elected officials accountable too, right?
Yeah.
Making sure they're actually representing the people, not just themselves or special interest groups.
Bingo. And it's not just about national politics either. Get involved locally. Go to town hall meetings, call your representatives, join community organizations. It all makes a difference.
But it's tough these days, right? With all the political polarization, it feels like nobody can even talk about these issues without things getting crazy. Everyone's in their own little bubble, only talking to people who already agree with them.
That's one of the biggest hurdles, no doubt. And it's something authoritarian leaders use to their advantage. They love division and mistrust. So we've got to try to bridge those gaps, listen to different points of view, and have respectful conversations, even when it's hard.
It's like we need to find some common ground again, some shared reality where we can at least agree on basic facts.
And that's where critical thinking comes in. We have to be able to filter information, question what we're being told, and form our own opinions based on facts.
Makes sense. But it's tough to stay positive when you see all the bad stuff happening in the world. How do we avoid getting sucked into that negativity and feeling like it's hopeless?
It's natural to feel overwhelmed, especially with all the bad news out there. But remember, throughout history, people have always found ways to resist tyranny and fight for a better world.
Like those who stood up to the Nazis, the civil rights activists, all the people who fought against oppression everywhere.
Exactly. Their stories show us that even small acts of resistance matter. It's not always about grand gestures. It's about the everyday choices we make, the conversations we have, the information we share, the organizations we support.
So even though things feel pretty messed up right now, we shouldn't underestimate what we can do, both individually and collectively.
For sure. The future isn't set in stone. We have the power to shape it.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. It's been super insightful.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and don't lose hope. That's what keeps democracy alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.